Electricity in Puerto Rico was born as an elitist luxury, not as a public and accessible service. In 1883, during Spanish rule, the first experimental electrical system was installed in the San Juan Theater. It was operated by private Spanish and Puerto Rican companies, such as the Puerto Rico Electric Company. This system used a steam generator imported from Siemens and other European manufacturers. To power arc lights during theatrical performances, electricity was an exclusive privilege of the elites. It was used only in theaters, hotels, and wealthy residences in the capital, with no public grid available. In 1890, a Spanish decree invited proposals to electrify the island of Puerto Rico, but the colonial government prioritized the interests of coffee and sugar producers. Tobacco and rum, sectors dominated by Spaniards and Creole landowners, leaving the general population behind and hindering progress. In March 1893, the coffee plantation owner José Ramón Figueroa y Rivera from Villalba installed a private generator on his estate, lighting the first electric bulb for individual use in Puerto Rico. That same year, the Sociedad Anónima de Luz Eléctrica, SALE, established the first public lighting in San Juan, illuminating the plazas de Armas and Colón. The first formal power plant was inaugurated in 1892 in Puerta de Tierra, San Juan, the Puerta de Tierra Electric Power Station. It operated on imported coal, produced between 50 and 100 kilowatts, and supplied power to only a few blocks of the historic district. By 1895, electrification mainly covered commercial streets and public buildings. The costs were high, and the service was unstable. Therefore, it only benefited merchants, Spaniards, and local elites. The majority of the population, especially in rural areas, continued living in complete darkness. After the U.S. 1898 invasion, Canadian and American investors took control of electric power generation. Companies such as the Puerto Rico Railway, Light and Power Company, Canadian, and the Ponce Electric Company from the United States, and the Mayagüez Light, Ice and Power Company, Puerto Rican, focused on urban areas, supplying street lamps, trolleys, and sugar industries. Meanwhile, rural areas remained without electrical service. Electricity mainly served the elites and the government offices controlled by the United States. In 1915, the colonial government began developing public infrastructure with the Carite-Yen hydroelectric plant in Guayama, using the reservoirs created under the Public Irrigation Act of 1908. On May 2, 1941, during the administration of Governor Rexford G. Tugwell, Law 83 was enacted, creating the Puerto Rico Water Resources Authority, AFF. This public corporation's mission was to unify the island's scattered electrical networks and harness water resources for irrigation, flood control, and power generation. Although electricity generation was initially a secondary goal, the authority managed about 21 dams, many of which were built before 1960, and relied mainly on hydraulic systems. Plants such as Carite devoted up to 85% of their output to pumping water for agriculture. Their main role was not electricity. However, these entities marked the beginning of the state electric monopoly. In 1945, the Puerto Rico Water Resources Authority acquired the assets of private companies such as the Puerto Rico Railway, Light and Power Company, and the Mayagüez Light, Ice and Power Company, forming a unified island-wide network and extending electrical service to previously underserved rural areas. The Puerto Rico Water Resources Authority played a key role in driving Operation Bootstrap. The industrialization program launched in 1947 to attract investment from the United States through tax incentives and cheap labor. At first, Power generation relied on clean and inexpensive hydroelectric sources, but by the 1950s, demand had surpassed hydraulic capacity, leading to a shift toward fossil fuels. Investments were made in thermoelectric plants that used imported fuel oil, such as the expansions of the San Juan plant beginning in 1950. This transition enabled a rapid expansion of energy capacity, but created total dependence on importing oil. The 1973 OPEC oil crisis worsened the situation. The price of crude oil quadrupled, severely impacting Puerto Rico's electrical system and revealing that it was obsolete. By 1979, 98% of the island's energy came from oil, and only 2% was hydroelectric. Electricity rates soared to levels 2 or 3 times higher than those in the United States. That same year, the Puerto Rico Water Resources Authority was officially renamed the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, PREPA, consolidating the state monopoly. During the 1980s and 1990s, PREPA massively expanded its infrastructure, building or modernizing plants such as Costa Sur and Aguirre, all dependent on oil. Although this fueled pharmaceutical and manufacturing industrialization, it also generated massive debt, over $9 billion by 2010. Dependence on imported fuels, outdated plants, and poor management led to extremely high rates and a vulnerable system. Natural disasters exposed that fragility. Hurricane Hugo in 1989 caused significant damage, but Hurricane Maria in 2017 was devastating. 95% of the electrical grid collapsed, leaving millions without power for months and causing thousands of indirect deaths. By then, PREPA was already technically bankrupt, leaving millions without power for months and causing thousands of indirect deaths. By then, PREPA was already technically bankrupt. In 2018, Law 120 allowed the partial privatization of the electrical system. In June 2020, the government signed a 10-year contract with Luma Energy, a partnership between the Canadian company ATCO and the U.S. company Quanta Services, for $6 billion. Luma took control of transmission and distribution on June 1, 2021, while generation, still mostly fossil-based, remained under PREPA. However, the transition has been problematic. Frequent blackouts, rate increases, layoffs of local employees, and poor responses to emergencies such as Hurricane Fiona in 2022, which left 1.5 million people without power. Despite government promises of modernization, the outcome has been the opposite. The system remains unreliable and inefficient. In 2023, about 62% of the island's energy still came from oil, 24% from natural gas, 8% from coal, and only 7% from renewable sources. Luma has systematically failed to meet its commitments to improve the system's quality and stability, while the government and the company continue to blame each other for the failures. The history of Puerto Rico's electrical system reveals how political and economic power have long dictated access to an essential service, from the time we were a Spanish colony to the present day. From the very beginning of Spanish rule, electricity was conceived as a privilege of the upper class. Under U.S. control, Puerto Rico remained dependent on external sources for an essential service. It imported all its oil, gas, and coal, and decisions about its electrical system were influenced by U.S. interests and policies. With the creation of the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, PREPA, progress was made in bringing electricity to rural areas and promoting industrialization, but the country never achieved energy or economic independence. There were also serious structural failures, such as dependence on oil, poor management, and the lack of sustainable planning. Privatization under Luma did not solve those problems. On the contrary, it made them worse. Following the announcement of the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority's privatization in 2021 and the transfer of the grid to the private company Luma Energy, the Puerto Rican people responded with a strong wave of protests. Thousands of citizens took to the streets to denounce the ongoing blackouts, rising electricity rates, and the lack of transparency surrounding the contract. The Electrical and Irrigation Industry Workers Union, UTIR, led much of the resistance, arguing that privatization represented the loss of public assets and the elimination of labor rights that had been won over decades. Workers organized marches, strikes, and demonstrations in front of government buildings, demanding that the electrical service remain in the hands of the people, and that the expertise of the technical staff from the former public corporation be respected. For UTIR, this process was not merely an administrative transition, but a historic betrayal of the generations who had built Puerto Rico's electrical infrastructure through sacrifice and hard work. Puerto Rico needs a profound energy transformation, not only technical, but also political, economic, and ethical. It's not about changing cables or contracts. It's about redefining electricity as a right, not as a business. To invest in renewable energy not as a trend but as a matter of survival. To build a fair, resilient system centered on the people, not on corporate interests. The priority must be the American citizens of Puerto Rico. If you liked this story, follow us and give it a like to learn more. See you next time.